What's the worst thing that's ever happened to humans? At number 8 is the Atlantic slave trade. While most of the world practiced slavery in one form or another, and slavery still takes place in some parts of the world such as Africa and has largely been eradicated in parts of the world such as North America and Europe. The Atlantic slave trade stands unique in that it was one of the most rapid and large-scale slave trades in human history and has caused racial divisions that have lasted for centuries. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the most cataclysmic, dehumanizing, and transformative events in human history. It forcibly reshaped continents such as Africa, the Americas, and Europe. When Europeans colonized the Americas, their initial plan for labor was not to import enslaved Africans. They intended to use indigenous labor, especially under systems like encomiendas. However, the massive depopulation of Native Americans caused by smallpox, measles, influenza, and brutal working conditions led to a catastrophic labor shortage. In some areas, up to 90% of the indigenous population died within a century of contact. This collapse left European colonists with vast plantations, mines, and colonies that had land and resources but no workers. So they turned to Africa, where there were already existing slave markets and systems of enslavement in parts of West and Central Africa. A major misconception about the transatlantic slave trade is that Europeans simply invaded Africa and kidnapped millions of people. In reality, only a small fraction were taken that way. The vast majority of slaves were sold by other Africans, often prisoners of war, criminals, or members of rival ethnic groups. Powerful African kingdoms already practiced slavery for centuries before European contact, and their militaries were far too strong for Europeans to raid freely. It would have either ended in catastrophic warfare and Europeans being decimated or losing huge swaths of their armies to warfare. So the Europeans opted instead to trade with the Africans. European traders relied on negotiation and commerce, not direct conquest, to obtain enslaved people. European traders exploited and expanded these systems, creating the transatlantic slave trade, one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Unlike the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africans didn't have full immunity to smallpox, measles, or influenza, but they did have greater relative resistance than indigenous Americans due to long-term exposure over centuries. In Afro-Eurasia, diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza had circulated for thousands of years, largely because of dense populations, urban centers, and close contact with domesticated animals, which were the original sources of many pandemics. This meant that by the 15th to 17th centuries, many Africans and Europeans had some level of inherited or acquired immunity. Those who survived childhood infections passed on genetic resistance or had lifelong antibodies. Smallpox in particular was endemic in parts of Africa, so people were exposed early and either died or developed immunity. The reasons why Native Americans didn't have immunity to these diseases are that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were biologically isolated from the Old World or Afro-Eurasia. For over 12,000 years, in fact. They had no exposure to Old World pathogens like smallpox, measles, or influenza. Now, having newly arrived to the New World, European colonizers had massive demand for cheap, reliable labor. The Native American populations collapsed due to Old World diseases, leaving Europeans without a labor force. African slaves were seen as a solution. They had agricultural skills, resistant to tropical diseases, and could endure harsh climates. The growing European empires, such as Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, sought wealth through plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These industries depended on mass labor, and slave labor became the economic backbone of these colonies. Some African kingdoms, such as Dahomey, Oyo, and Ashanti, participated in the trade by capturing rival groups and selling them to European traders in exchange for guns, textiles, and goods. The Atlantic slave trade also gave birth to the triangular trade system, where Europeans would go to Africa and trade guns, alcohol, and goods for slaves. And Africans went to the Americas, where millions of Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, which was also known as the Middle Passage. And finally, the trade route from the Americas to Europe, where raw materials like sugar, cotton, and tobacco were sent back for profit. This was one of the first globalized economic systems built entirely on human suffering. Europeans began developing racial ideologies to justify slavery, claiming Africans were inferior or naturally suited for servitude. These ideas laid the groundwork for modern racism, which persisted long after the trade ended. The effects of the slave trade were a massive human cost. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Historians estimate that 2 million died during the brutal Middle Passage from disease, dehydration, and abuse. Millions more died during raids or forced marches to the coast. Slaves faced harsh conditions, such as overcrowding and confinement. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into ships' holds, often chained together in rows with barely 50 centimeters of space between them. A typical slave ship might carry 400 to 600 people, far beyond its capacity. They were forced to lie flat, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes chained wrist to wrist or ankle to ankle. Filth, disease, and starvation ran rampant on these slave ships. There were no toilets, so people had to relieve themselves where they lay. The stench was unbearable. Ships could be smelled before they were even seen. Common diseases included dysentery, smallpox, measles, and scurvy. Food was minimal and often rotting, usually a thin porridge or beans. Water was filthy and rationed. Death rates ranged from 10 to 20% per voyage, meaning roughly 2 million people died before even reaching land. Slaves also faced harsh violence as a form of discipline. Sailors used whips, chains, and irons to maintain control. Anyone who resisted was beaten, tortured, or thrown overboard. Women and girls were frequently taken advantage of and sexually assaulted by crew members, often as a form of domination or reward. Many enslaved Africans committed suicide, jumping overboard to escape. Some refused to eat and were force-fed using metal clamps or burning coals pressed to their lips. Others believed death would return them home spiritually, and so leapt willingly into the sea, a form of ultimate defiance. Families were torn apart during capture, sale, and transport. Husbands, wives, and children were separated forever, often sold to different plantations. The impact on Africa itself was catastrophic too. Some regions lost up to 1/3 of their population. The influx of European weapons and the constant demand for captives fueled wars between African states. So Africans even began going to war so that they could enslave each other. Entire economies in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States depended on slave labor. The wealth that built European cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon, and even parts of the American economy, was rooted in slavery. To maintain control, colonizers developed strict racial caste systems, privileging Europeans, enslaving Africans, and marginalizing mixed-race populations. This laid the foundation for centuries of systemic racism, colonial domination, and segregation across the Americas and beyond. By the late 18th century, growing moral, religious, and philosophical opposition, especially from Quakers, Enlightenment thinkers, and freed slaves, led to abolition movements. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807, the US in 1808, and slavery itself was abolished gradually through the 19th century. Brazil in 1888 being the last major nation to ban slavery. Now, the Atlantic slave trade actually links quite heavily to the next cataclysmic event in this list. Do you think you can guess what it is?